Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Before I begin, I would like to extend my gratitude to the Classical Studies Department for allowing me to engage in this research, the History Department through the support of the James McCord European Studies Award for providing me with the opportunity to do research abroad, to the panel members, Professor Hutton and Professor Pope, for their assistance with ancient language work, and of course my thesis advisor, Professor Stevens, for overseeing my research and assisting me with every step along the way to its completion. I present to you Man, Myth, and Medicine, Religious Exchange in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. I've had one question come up quite frequently when I discuss the topic of my thesis, so allow me to begin with a disclaimer to address it. I am not here to tell you the Greek gods are real. As much as I would love if that was the case, it is a very, very difficult thing to prove. Actually, Zeus, if you're real, strike me down now! Okay, still alive. So, Greek gods, not real. Although the gods themselves might not be real, like any great idea or belief, they are inspired by the real world. Early humans didn't understand so much of the world around them. The sun, storms, the earth, even death. These were all powerful forces of nature that man couldn't control. They were gods. That was the only way mankind could rationalize them, then beg for the gods' gifts or to be spared tragedy. Like the rest of their pantheons, healing gods are based on the real world, but not in the same way. They are not simply manifestations of the human conception of healing. Healing itself isn't a natural force. Sure, physical ailments might resolve themselves in time, but even the earliest humans understood that they needed help to deal with these maladies. I think this is best exemplified in the words of anthropologist Margaret Mead. A student once asked her what she believed to be the earliest sign of a civilized society. One might suspect some form of architecture, or perhaps communication, some form of writing. No. Mead responded with a 15,000-year-old fractured femur, and she said, "The first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur that had been healed. In the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. A broken femur that is healed is evidence that someone has taken the time to stay with the one who fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended the person through recovery. Helping someone else through difficulty is where civilization starts." Healing is not a product of the natural world. It is a concept invented by humans. Perhaps that's why so many physician gods across dozens of civilizations begin their stories as humans. But if the gods are based on real phenomena, the healing gods should be no different. Healing was a human activity, so the gods of healing would have to be based on humans. In one circumstance, we know for a fact who that human was. An Egyptian man living roughly 5,000 years ago. A man whose lifetime merited an apotheosis more than any other. And who was that man? I'd like to turn to noted Egyptologist Jonathan Carnahan to answer the question. Jonathan? Imhotep. Thanks, Jonathan. Imhotep is known to many as the titular villain of the Mummy movies of 1932 and 1999. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of the franchise, but their portrayal of Imhotep is abysmal. Imhotep was far from a monster movie villain. In reality, he was the hero of Egyptian society with a life so well lived, it merited an apotheosis. Imhotep lived around the 27th century BC under the reign of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty of ancient Egypt, and he accomplished a lot. Imhotep was the vizier to Pharaoh Djoser, serving as the closest advisor to this king. We know this from the base of a statue of King Djoser found in his tomb. He was the high priest of Ra in Heliopolis, and in this role he ended a famine. If an invocation in song is to be believed, Imhotep was a skilled poet and writer. In his role as an architect, Imhotep constructed the first pyramid, known as the Step Pyramid of Djoser, and the buried pyramid of Sekhemkhet. And most importantly, he was a physician, if conclusions drawn from the Edwin Smith Papyrus are correct. Basically, he was a Renaissance man 4,000 years before the Renaissance. Although stories of his lifetime tend to be exaggerated, it is well established that Imhotep was a real person. So how does this real-world polymath become a god? Imhotep became a god due to his work as a physician among mortals and gods. Ever heard the expression, "my body is a temple"? Well, the Egyptian gods meant that quite literally. There was an understanding in ancient Egypt that the temple of a god was their physical form on earth, indicating that a monument is a type of body for the gods. As an architect, Imhotep was tending to the bodies of the divine, and as a physician, Imhotep was tending to the bodies of humans. His reputation was that of a physician to all. By accomplishing all that he did and recording it for future generations, Imhotep ensured his legacy would last for centuries, and this legacy merited an apotheosis. If this was all it took to become a god, as if constructing monumental architecture and becoming a physician were not already difficult undertakings, then anyone who accomplished the same feats should be deified by the Egyptian people. There is only one other ancient Egyptian man who became a god without being a pharaoh. This was Amenhotep, son of Hapu. Amenhotep was a physician and an architect living in the 14th century BCE. He designed and constructed the mortuary temple of Amenhotep the Great. Amenhotep the Great was a pharaoh with no relation to the architect. I know there are a lot of Amenhoteps. I mean, here we've got Hapu and the third one. There will be more to come. Well, more about the great one to come. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, is famously remembered by his epithet, true of voice, right there on his tomb, for his work as a scribe. He accomplished great medical and architectural feats and preserved them in text. He is a living, deified confirmation of why Imhotep was deserving of an apotheosis. First, Imhotep was the son of the god Ptah and a mortal woman, and later, after death, Imhotep was declared the god of medicine, a legacy which would spread out across the ancient Mediterranean world. If you have ever had a conversation with me lasting more than 10 seconds, the story of Imhotep is probably beginning to sound familiar to you. Human-born physician, son of a god and a mortal woman, his healing skills as a demigod were well revered. He eventually dies and becomes the god of healing and medicine. I'm already roughly 10 minutes into this defense, so it is well past time to mention Asclepius. That's really him, I'm sure, but I think that's actually how the statue looks. The resemblance is uncanny. In the Mediterranean world, it was quite common for the Greek gods to be given the identities of Egyptian gods. This was especially true in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's conquest. So it is unsurprising that the identity of Imhotep was plastered onto Asclepius. They share very similar stories, after all. But I would like to put forth a new theory. Asclepius was not given a new name or new identity of any kind. Rather, his original name, a name that belonged to him several millennia before the rise of the Greeks, was returned to him. Asclepius was Imhotep. Unfortunately, I have yet to find the Bronze Age stela inscription that reads, "This is the Bronze Age Greeks. The Egyptians just told us about this really cool god named Imhotep, and we're going to incorporate him into our pantheon as Asclepius. Congratulations, Ryan, you're right." I would really love if we found this. But unfortunately, as of the current moment, we have not. And I don't think we're going to find it anytime soon. As I've already established that these gods share very similar stories, identities, and domains, it will only take a few criteria to validate this theory. I'm not proving it's definitely true, just providing the evidence to show this idea is not without merit. First, Imhotep's story must have been well known throughout Egypt around the emergence of Asclepius in Greece. Second, there must be proven interaction between the Egyptians and the Greeks at the time of Asclepius' emergence, when the story of Imhotep would likely be shared. And finally, Asclepius must be Egyptian. To start with that first point, when did Asclepius emerge? Well, Asclepius is far older than Asclepius. That sounds very confusing, I know. Allow me to clarify. Paion Asclepius, as he is widely recognized by classical scholars, is the amalgamation of two figures from Greek mythology: a mortal healer from Thessaly, probably named Asclepius, and a death-curing god of medicine and healing from the Peloponnese, named Paion. Paion was the definitive Greek god of healing for quite some time. His first attestation emerged in the Mycenaean civilization around the late Bronze Age, whereas Asclepius didn't emerge until the Archaic period in name, and then the 5th century as a god, when his attributes were merged with that of the northern physician to create Asclepius as we all know him. And Paeon's name became one of Asclepius' epithets, meaning the divine healer. It really pains me to say this, but we're gonna have to put Asclepius aside for a moment to focus on Paeon. Paeon's name first appears in the KNV 52 tablet discovered in Knossos. This tablet comes from somewhere between late Minoan II and late Minoan IIIa period, roughly between 1450 and 1350 BCE. And Imhotep's story was widely circulating at the time. Imhotep lived in the 27th century BCE. Although he wouldn't be recognized as the Egyptians as a god until 525 BCE, he was worshipped in a similar way, being a demigod, as early as the 26th century BCE. There are 2 stories of Imhotep that most likely would have been circulating at the time of Paeon's conception. These would have been the stories of Imhotep as a physician, originating from his creation of the medical text known as the Edwin Smith Papyrus. And there would have been the story of Imhotep ending a famine, a story we know today from the famine stela. The story goes that a drought struck Egypt and caused a famine. So Pharaoh Djoser sent his vizier Imhotep to Hermopolis to determine the cause of the drought. Imhotep learns that it was brought about by the god Khnum. In a dream, Khnum tells Imhotep that he will allow the Nile to flow again, and Pharaoh Djoser agrees to repair the temple of Khnum at Elephantine. Evidence of this story goes back to the 25th century BCE, and Imhotep experienced a resurgence in popularity right around the time of Paeon's emergence. So now we have to ask, how did this story get to Greece? It would have come from the voyages of Amenhotep III. Amenhotep III, also known as Amenhotep the Great, was the 9th pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, roughly 14th century BCE. His reign saw a peak in the prosperity of ancient Egypt. Since everything was going well in his homeland, he began to explore the larger Mediterranean world to establish some sense of foreign relations. We know this from a statue base discovered in his mortuary complex. It lists a number of locations that Amenhotep sent ambassadors to. This list includes Messenia, Western Anatolia, Crete, and the Argolid, home of the Mycenaeans. And we know the voyage, at least to the Argolid, was carried out as written. A number of faience fragments have been discovered in Mycenae. These pieces, typically used in Egypt to adorn palaces, were clearly designated as offerings of goodwill from the Egyptians to the Mycenaeans. Whenever they are discovered, they are always easy to date, because these pieces are imprinted with the name of the pharaoh they were created under. Here, we see the ones in Mycenae are imprinted with the name of Amenhotep the Great, clearly proving the voyages around the Mediterranean were real and successful. For those of you familiar with the Bronze Age Mediterranean, you may recognize this time period as the end of the world! The Bronze Age collapse, as it is called, was a period of drought, famine, and slowdown in societal and cultural growth. The Egyptians continued to prosper throughout this period, but for the rest of the Mediterranean world, it was the downfall of some major civilizations. I want you all in the mindset of the Mycenaeans for a moment. You're currently dealing with the Bronze Age collapse. One of the most pressing issues of the time is famine. You receive visitors from one of the most prosperous empires of the time. You can't exactly ask for more food. It is a long journey by boat. You might be dead before it returns. Not to mention the pharaoh who took over after Amenhotep III was not particularly friendly. So what can you ask for? A solution. Maybe the Egyptians had dealt with a famine in their rise to power, and as previously mentioned, according to legend, they did. At this point, Imhotep is a divine physician, and to the Mycenaeans receiving this story, he is known as the Great One of Hermopolis. In Egyptian, Panawenu. Around the same time, a new god is first recorded as part of the Mycenaean pantheon, a god who goes by the name Paewon, later Paeon. At the time of Paeon's origin, Imhotep's story was circulating, and a direct line of cultural exchange had been established between the Egyptians and the Greeks. An epithet describing Imhotep's accomplishments in Hermopolis bears a striking similarity to Paeon's name. The most conclusive evidence at this point would be any evidence to suggest that Paeon actually came from Egypt. So the question, is Paeon Egyptian? The idea that a Greek god could come from Egypt is certainly not without precedent. In his histories, Herodotus states, the Egyptians were also the first to establish the tradition of identifying names for the 12 gods, and that the Hellenes adopted this practice from them. They were also the first to assign altars, statues, and temples to the gods, and to carve their figures in reliefs on stone. This is from Book 2 of Herodotus, where he's discussing Egypt. This indicates that there was some exchange of religious practices from the Egyptians to the Greeks. But more importantly, I would like to turn to Homer, where he directly states in his Odyssey of Egypt, every man is a healer there, more skilled than any other men on earth, for they are of the race of Paeon. Homer uses the term genethles to refer to race in this circumstance, and it is being used in an ethnographic sense. Paeon is of the race the Egyptians are of, which would be the Egyptian race. This was not new information to the archaic Greeks, though. Going back to the first attestation of Paeon's name in Linear B, the name has been identified as etymologically foreign to both Mycenaean Greeks and the Minoans. So where does this name come from? We just have to break down the name to find out. Pa and iao. Iao gives us the Greek iaomai, the verb for heal. But pa, the beginning, is kind of strange here, unless one considers that pa is a common beginning for ancient Egyptian personal masculine names, especially those relating to the gods. So to conclude, the Greeks viewed Paeon as Egyptian. They stated it directly in texts, and his name consists of Egyptian elements. The Egyptian god, Paeon, emerged shortly after the arrival of the Egyptians sent on behalf of a pharaoh, whose reign saw the resurgence of Imhotep's popularity. And according to myth, Imhotep was quite capable of solving the problems the Mycenaeans at the time were dealing with. I am fully aware that a lot of this evidence I presented is circumstantial, and no definitive confirmation can be made until we find that proof stela, which I really hope we find, and I really hope it has my name in it. That would be crazy. But as historians and classical scholars, we are often forced to rely upon pieces of evidence to construct a full picture. I have seen detailed reconstructions of ancient Greek art from no more than a fragment of the original picture. It can be done because we know the history around it. In the present, we have the surrounding history of healing gods in the Mediterranean world, and it is well documented thanks to the Egyptians. Egypt is a definitive part of classical studies, and yet it often goes forgotten unless we're talking about Alexander the Great or Cleopatra. But Egypt has a treasure trove of historical texts dating back to long before the first evidence of a Greek alphabet. And this history can provide us with so much missing information. We just have to use the same logic we always use to fill in the gaps. It is often said that history has a cyclical nature, and my thesis seems to confirm that to some extent. Imhotep was the beginning of a medical and religious tradition that expanded throughout the Mediterranean world. First, the stories of healing gods were brought into the Mycenaean pantheon, and later, physicians like Hippocrates, the father of medicine, traveled to Egypt to learn about the healing arts from their source. Ultimately, when Egypt is brought definitively into the Greco-Roman world, the cycle is closed, with the physician god Pan Asclepius regaining his original name, Imhotep. Thank you very much.